Hello survivors and welcome to Triptocaine, a Heavy Rain podcast by Resident Evil fans for Resident Evil fans. This is First Aid Spray bonus episode 11, wherein we'll be hunkering down to weather the storm of someone's pile of shame selection in our look back at 2010's Heavy Rain. My name is Syniac, you can just call me Sy, and joining me on the panel this week, press X to Jason, it's Fire Button Steve Valance.
Jason!
Press X to Jason, it's Moist Owlet aka James.
Jason!
Press X to Jason from Serial Box 64, it's Jordan Subru.
Jason?
And press X to Sean from Sceneforge Games, it's Sherwin Matthews.
Jason!
The subject of this bonus episode, like all others, was voted on by our Patreon backers. Support the show now to not only keep us afloat, but also to create new content. Select what that content is and hear it a month before everyone else. Tiers begin at just $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/FA Spray Pod for the full breakdown. So, shout out at the top of the show, as always, to our contribution. This time it's a musical contribution from David Debono. Thank you to him for supplying his piano cover of the track Painful Memories from Heavy Rain. Sort of a last minute thing, so very thankful for him for getting back to me as quickly and enthusiastically as he did. So please listen out for his cover, which will be in this episode to break up our discussion. And Heavy Rain comes to you via the Pile of Shame episodes, as we talked about at the beginning. This is episode 3 now of the Pile of Shame series. And for those of you who have maybe missed the earlier ones, essentially every member of the First Aid Spray team has taken a game that they wanted to play at some point or feel like they should have played and either didn't get around to it or didn't quite beat it. We put them all in a poll, just the game names, not who selected them. And then the winner of the poll gets an episode. And we are going to reveal who picked Heavy Rain when we get to that point. But first of all, let's just do a little bit of an introduction on the game itself. It took 4 years to produce Heavy Rain, with a legendary 2,000-page script and a cost of over 40 million euros, adjusted for inflation and then converted to GBP. That's about 39 million pounds in today's money. The game was directed by David Cage and produced as a spiritual successor to his previous story-focused game Fahrenheit, with Shenmue cited as an inspiration for some of the controls. Cage wanted to make a motion controller specific for the game, but it was financially unviable. But the game was released 8 months after its initial debut with a Move edition, which used the PlayStation Move controllers and camera. The game was released to high praise. Eurogamer and IGN gave it 9 out of 10. Game Informer gave it 9.5 out of 10. GameSpot 8.5. Edge a 7. The Metacritic score for the PS3 original sits at 87 over 100. David Cage predicted between 20,000 and 30,000 sales, but the game reached 1 million in 2 months and then continued from there. It outsold any Xbox title in Europe during its first 13 weeks in the charts, and it is considered, of course, one of the best-selling games for the PlayStation 3 system. So, first question, as always, is what was everybody's first introduction to the game, first time being made aware of it, and if you played it before, what was that experience like and when? I may as well start. This is my first time playing it. It's not my pick for Pile of Shame, but equally I'd not played it until now. Being an Xbox owner for that whole period, the PS3 and Xbox 360 era, I didn't get onto a PS3 until sort of the end of that time, just coincidentally because my partner had one when I met her. So I just thought, oh cool, now I can play the PlayStation games that I missed, by which I mean the Uncharted games, and I think that's pretty much it. I remember this being a thing when it was announced, and it was going to be this huge innovation of graphics and storytelling, but equally I don't remember it particularly grabbing me, but there you go, I've had my first playthrough now. Steve, what was your first experience with Heavy Rain? Have you played it before the podcast?
Yeah, I did. So back in the day, I had a 360, much like Sy, and eventually, being an aspiring YouTuber, I thought I'd branch out and record from new consoles and got a PS3. And at the time, I was just, milling around looking for games, and someone recommended it to me because I liked the Walking Dead game by Telltale. And that's literally it. I just got recommended it and went through it. I obviously, the marketing and stuff, yeah, at the time it had released, I hadn't had a PS3, so just kind of like, oh, no, that's cool, I'll get to it when I get to it. And then I experienced the adventure of Ethan Mars and friends. It wasn't any massive draw than that. It was just being recommended it and then having a copy thrust into my hands, which is still the copy I played today. They don't want the game back. So I think I'm underlying message there.
Jordan, what was your first experience with Heavy Rain like?
Well, it's a little bit backwards because I would say that my first experience with anything to do with Heavy Rain was the 2006 tech demo known as the casting, which was a short demonstration of not only the kind of technology that they were going to be using, for the games going forward, but also sort of the dramatic punch. So, I mean, I thought that was a very effective demonstration of performance, emotion-driven cinematics. It's not necessarily aged as well, but it is 2006, and for 2006, it was pretty mind-blowing. But it turned out that I'd already played a Quantic Dream game, or at least part of it, and that was Fahrenheit. And I enjoyed it. I mean, the idea of it being sort of a crime thriller was a really cool hook. But I just remember putting it down when I got to a point where, there was imaginary bugs and, one too many sort of trial and error instances on like a flashback sequence. And I just fell out of favor with the game. So I liked the idea of it. I was behind and I was invested in the idea of it. But besides that, I just couldn't get into it. And it was the same thing when I first played Heavy Rain back in, I think it's 2011. And I just couldn't get into those first hours of the game because it's quite slow, quite depressing. And I just kind of put it down. But it's one of those areas of gaming I've always been sort of fascinated by. Like I want to enjoy it. I want to understand it. I want to like it. But I just wasn't getting that. I was having a failure to launch with it. But yeah, that's my experience prior to this.
James, have you played Heavy Rain before now?
Yeah. So I just, I actually played it in 2015 because I was speaking to the lads before this and said 2014. But I know it's 2015 because I bought my PS3 when I bought another one of their games called Beyond Two Souls.
Yeah.
And that came out in 2015. So, I got it then. I bought an old PS3 and I started up, and it's very similar to Jordan. Like I started it up, and then I got to a point, and then I was like, I don't know what it was at the time. I just couldn't get into it at that point, and we'll talk more about that later on. But yeah, I just put it down after that, and I only got it because of Beyond Two Souls, and I actually enjoyed Beyond Two Souls way more than I did Heavy Rain. But yeah, that was my first experience.
Interesting. So it seems so far, Steve, you're probably the only person on this panel who finished the game. I'm assuming finished the game the first time you played it.
Yeah,
seems like that way.
It's funny Jordan mentions Fahrenheit. I hadn't actually put the two together in the head. Of course, they are the same developer, and it's like, yeah, that wasn't even a draw at the time. So am I right in thinking if reading the room, I'm the only person who's beat this game twice?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay, that's going to be interesting. Right.
And Sherwin, you picked this game for Pile of Shame, so I'm intrigued. What was it about the game that sort of grabbed your interest, albeit not enough for you to actually get around to it?
Do you know, I feel like I almost owe all of you a massive apology on this one. And it's mostly due to my complete lack of understanding of what this beast was when I chose it. Heavy Rain's a game that I've heard a few of my friends talk about over the years, about in really nondescript ways, about how, hey, yeah, we really love playing this game. Oh, it's really, really cool. Kind of, oh, I was so scared during this moment, or I was so, I lost a lot of time playing this thing, or whatever else. And I never knew anything about it whatsoever. I completely missed. That's a period of my life where I just wasn't really paying any attention to a lot of video games at the time, in terms of what was being released or anything else. So I certainly wasn't caught up in any hype about its release or anything else. And what's really interesting is when I chose it, I chose Heavy Rain because I'd heard quite a few people I know talking about how it's a really important game to play, and genuinely thought it was a survival horror game because of the visuals. So at At that point, I basically put the two together, going, "Well, what game should you really have played? Well, you should have played Survival Horror Game Show, and it's a Resident Evil podcast. Yeah, that's true. And this one's one that everyone is talking about. So yeah, I should go Heavy Rain. And having now played the Beast, I understand how woefully incorrect that was. Simply put, there is a degree of survival horror, but not in the sense that you want to have.
Yeah, to an extent, there is survival, literal survival. So I guess it kind of works.
Yeah, but so that's my experience of it. So this was my choice, and my first experience of playing this game, it was playing Detroit Become Human, which we'll get onto in time.
It's so funny that I understand now, because when I asked everyone for a game, and we got stuff like, I put out there Metal Gear Solid, we got Last of Us. This is examples of games we've already covered through the series. When you said Heavy Rain, I was like, wow, that's very unexpected, but that kind of explains it now. I think the best place to start, coincidentally, is with visual design. One of the key selling points was the way that the game looks. I guess it was an advancement in motion capture and stuff at the time. As Jordan, you kind of referenced the casting, teaser and trailer and sort of the early stuff before we even really saw what the game was. But it's funny, showing that you say survival horror, because this is neither really here or there, but it did kind of make me... I kind of wanted the game to turn out to be a Silent Hill game at points. It kind of looks a bit like it could be a Silent Hill game. Aesthetically, and some of it's, the dark and depressing story beats about lost children and stuff like that. It does have that kind of style to it. But more to the point, overall, for a game that's now 11 years old, I would have to say that aesthetics in general, we're talking about specifically visual, I was very impressed with how this held up. I played this on a standard... a big old fat PS3 as well, I think it is. The original, the Move edition, which might be slightly prettier than the original release, but it's 8 months later, so I doubt it's really anything quantifiable. And for a game, released in 2010, I thought it looked pretty decent. Direction-wise, lighting-wise, I had very little issue with the way that it looked. Jordan, what did you think of the visual aspect of Heavy Rain?
Well, you're right in saying that it certainly has some impressive facets to it. It's a weird one, because you can clearly tell that there is something about the visuals that are a product of its extended development cycle. There's a drastic fluctuation in polish. So some scenes look great. Some scenes you could make that into a screenshot, and you could sell people on the visuals being maybe 1 or 2 years ahead of when it was actually made. But at the same time, there is there's certain scenes where it's almost like the manner of the lighting or the manner of the shaders ends up actually making it look worse. I mean, one of the sequences that stands out is I think it's the first night sequence when you've got Norman Jayden and he's actually going to one of the first crime scenes. And it looks so much worse than many of the other scenes. But I was blown away in certain respects, kind of going back to this, because I was expecting it to look a whole lot more rough.
Right.
No, it holds up well. The PS3 was not easy to develop for either. And this is a game that had already migrated from one console to another in amidst its development cycle. So you've got to expect a certain amount of that migration has been to the disservice of the visuals. But it holds up, and obviously the characters really come across well.
The seems to be a PS3 thing, using sort of just floating heads for the loading screens, because MGS4 does it, I think, and stuff like that. But that obviously is probably where it's the strongest, when you get these extreme close-ups of the character designs. That's where it looks the best. It's weird, because it does look like a product of its time, but it holds up a lot better than other games released this year for me. Steve, what do you think of the visuals?
It's this is a bit of a mess one for me. I think if it's a main player character model, or someone of like a significant importance, they are very well defined and designed. I feel like if it wasn't for the lighting and visual effects, a lot of the environments feel like they could have come out of a PS2 game, just well framed. Like this is a horrible bias, but you think about this came out in 2010, and Resident Evil 5 came out a year earlier.
Yeah.
And I would argue that we're going to get into it, but I'd argue the facial animation, the animations themselves, maybe not so much the environments, were stronger in that. Admittedly, differences in budget, difference in development team.
Sure.
Not saying it's bad. Not saying it's bad in the slightest in terms of its visual, identity. Color use is probably my main bugbear for this. Is a very brown and miserable game, but that is the era this game was developed in.
Yeah, so true.
Very much draped in that level of quote-unquote realism. I assure you, if you go outside, look outside your window right now, there is more color in that than there is in this game. And you could be in the middle of the Antarctic.
Sherwin, how do you feel about this game visually?
So yeah, aforementioned statement earlier about the fact that I thought it was a survival horror game based on the visuals, and I definitely echo what you're talking about with the Silent Hill connection. This game does feel very much like Silent Hill. The closest approximation I can make is it feels like Silent Hill 4. I think
Right.
it's almost like you're wandering around the street. You can see through the windows of Silent Hill 4. Do you know, for me, this game arrives from an era. I'll qualify that to start with. I will never ever look upon a game and kind of on its based on its visuals alone and think, well, this, base it on the time, kind of say the graphics are really poor on this for any reason or another. Like, it's not really. I always understand every game has its context and when it was released and so on.
Yeah.
So it's always difficult to make any comparison. And if you are exactly as Steve has done, you take it from other games around the same time. But what I will say is that this, for me, is a time that graphics were they're sort of super close to being really, really good, but not quite there yet. And as a result, it's something where it felt very jarring to play. Like, if it was something where it just felt a bit more kind of old school, then it would be fine, because I'm not quite making that connection. Whereas if it had been something that was a fraction more advanced, then at that point it's probably okay. At this point, it just felt something where I played it and kind of looking at characters walking around and thinking, you guys actually look really good. And then as soon as someone starts talking, go and sort of shy away from the screen a bit. And that's to do with how the animations work and everything else. So, but I mean, visually, from what it is a really dreary game in terms of the visuals of it. And from an artistic vision side, I know where they're coming from and the themes they're trying to do. But truthfully, I think there's a lot better ways to achieve that than simply just putting a sepia wash over everything.
I was just going to jump in and say now, obviously, people may or may not know that earlier in the development, it was intended to be additional themes, maybe more further psychological themes or even supernatural themes. Sequences that probably would be more fitting of Silent Hill. So it's interesting that you both pick up on that. And I wonder, since those elements were kind of abandoned quite late into development, whether or not the footprint left across the rest of the game kind of reflects that. Because it is very dreary, but if it was intended to be more psychological or supernatural, then that would at least be able to kind of prop it up.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Actually, I had no idea. James, what do you think of the visual design?
For 2010, the game, in my opinion, looks standard. You had Alan Wake come out that year as well, which was also a pretty good-looking game, and in my opinion, looked better than this game did, even though that game was dark. Everyone's face other than the loading screens, which look fantastic, everyone's face looked like the surface of like a porcelain vase. Especially when like light hit their face, there would just be like this strange texture to their face. But I mean, I just want to say as well, I know nothing about game design, and I super respect anybody who can do that. It's just, there's the color and the filter of this game as well. Like, I still, even though there was the first scene with Ethan and his family and stuff, like, I still didn't feel like from looking at everybody like that they were a family, like visually, like it was broken, and that was due to animations. The environments are super cool. Like I love that house. Like, I'd love to have that house. That was amazing. But yeah, and then like we're transported to this really dreary house, which we'll go into more later with the story, but we're not really explained why that happened. Like I'll get more into that later on. But yeah, visually the game looks good for 2010. Like, but at the same time, like as Sherwin said, at the same time, there are a whole bunch of games that came out in 2010 to 2012 that were doing this, and you could compare them pretty accurately with each other because they all look very similar. I wasn't blown away by it, and I played it. I mean, I did play in 2015. You know, we had some pretty baller games that came out that year, so I might have been swayed by that as well. But the following years, but I wasn't blown away by the visuals of it like a lot of other folks were. But that might have been biased.
Fair enough. I mean, it's all opinion at the end of the day. I do have high opinion on the other side of the aesthetic coin, particularly the music. Before we get into voice performance, I thought the music was really, really good, actually. Heavy Rain is quite a short game, and there's again it's reasons that we'll probably talk about later that it sort of works in its favour, that it's not a overtly long experience, and I've only played it once, but there are pieces of music that have stuck with me. You know, they're in my head now. I haven't forgotten it all. It didn't just wash over me. There are melodies and stuff that I can instantly think of if I were to pick that box back up and look at that cover. They're in my head. So that's really good. And most importantly for me, and these are the kind of things that I always love to point out, is just I love how each of the four main characters have completely different musical styles in their scenes. Ethan is sort of solo piano led. Norman has this full orchestra. Madison has a much smaller sort of chamber orchestra style. And Scott has the sort of classic detective, lots of sort of like brass. I really like that, and hearing the different, there are melodies that sort of sprinkle throughout, all in these different styles. Very impressed. Apparently, this isn't the first time that this composer has worked with David Cage. I don't know if they did anything after necessarily, but it's one of those things where I'd almost be curious to just sort of listen to some of their other compositions. I don't necessarily like listening to game soundtracks without having played the game first, but I'd be kind of curious to see the level of quality of other stuff they've done. But James, how did you feel about the music?
I agree with you. Like the music's definitely had an identity.
Yes,
with each character that came on, and like the use of the music during scenes was super well done as well. I really love the music of the game. It was super like it fit very well with each character. And even like the kind of the game sounds as well. Like the game sounds are pretty good.
Yeah.
I think the only time that I it was a really badass moment before we really got the true ending was Shelby, but like when I first heard the gun he shot off, I was like, but yeah, music awesome, very well done. Who was the person who did that? Do you know?
Norman Corbale.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, did a fantastic job. Right, like for me, I think that's the strongest point of the game. To be honest, is the music.
It's definitely up there for me as well. Jordan, how do you feel about the music?
Well, I agree with everything you both said. It is a very nice, well put together soundtrack. I think, perhaps with a changing nature of the game, it could have used an extra sort of dimension, perhaps a few more lighter, more hopeful themes for relief, because we'll reiterate this many times over throughout the podcast. It is a depressing game. There's a lot of dreariness, and the soundtrack definitely adds to that kind of emotional punch. Obviously, what the composer does, he does very well, and it's very effective. But you definitely feel like you could have had a bit of relief sometimes. I know that not all of the tracks. I don't believe that all of the tracks were originally composed for the game. There's there's an instance where if you have the fight with Mad Jack as Norman Jaden, there's a piece of music used in that I was like, hold on a second, I've heard this somewhere before, and I'm pretty sure it is a piece of like licensed music that could just generally be picked out by any studio to use. But it's like, if you go listen back to that, you might have heard it from a cartoon or a show or an advert at some point. So that was kind of interesting. But the soundtrack overall is really good, and I think as well, it's a big credit to the production that it manages to work so seamlessly. From a technical standpoint, it's not necessarily talked about a whole lot, but obviously producing a soundtrack for a video game can be quite difficult, because depending on the nature of the game, you have to make it dynamic, and it needs to respond to the actions of the player at a moment's notice. And this does it really well. I never felt like the soundtrack had to stall if I was taking too long on one segment. It always felt like it was
that's a good point.
Perfectly paced.
Steve, thoughts on the soundtrack?
I generally enjoyed it, but it felt more like backing stuff to me. Like outside of like playing the game, it's very more emotionally evocative. But when I was investing in the game, it kind of all blended together, with the exception of like the Painful Memories theme, that soft little piano ditty. Not a criticism, but the score in itself always reminds me of like your Nolan Batman films and stuff. Very when it's being when it's being authoritative, or when it's being like subtle. So yeah, it's fine. Not really something I'd go out and seek. I get that everyone else is taken away with it. I would say it's definitely one of the stronger parts of the game's aspects, except while playing it again, for me personally, kind of all blended into the mix. That perhaps might have been the nature of the way I was playing the game. So
fair enough. And Shoin, how do you feel about the music? And also, I'll let you move on to the voice acting. I'll let you have first dibs on that as well.
Okay. No, I echo exactly what you're saying about the soundtrack. I can't fault it. It works very, very well. In most cases, it's interesting how much I think the mark of a good soundtrack is always that it just feels part of any particular scene, especially in a game like this, where it kind of is, the whole thing is, you're kind of you're kind of viewing the entire experience as something where everything sort of has its part, and no one thing stands out and is really jarringly different to the rest. And I think this works exceptionally well. You don't ever listen to the soundtrack and go, that was lackluster, or that didn't really feel like it was well suited, or whatever else. It all builds in, whether that be the sound effects, any sort of actual music or whatever else that comes in. It all feels really well done, and that's fine. Like, it's not Resident Evil levels are good, but that's good because that's something else entirely. But it's good.
That's a better game.
I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to argue with you, and I don't think I could on this podcast. So even if I wanted to. But yeah, so no, it's not as good as Resident Evil Gaiden, but it is still pretty good. But no, but in terms of the voice acting, so I think the voice acting is very hit and miss.
Yeah,
is the honest answer to it. Some of the voice acting is, again, it's spot on for what it needs to be. There's nothing that sounds exceptional in terms of someone is overacting anything. It doesn't sound like anybody is really doing anything. What I think is the biggest problem with a lot of the voice acting that is in there, I imagine, is some probably fairly talented actors working with a script that is oftentimes quite wooden, or doesn't necessarily like what I get is that it's not so much a sense that you have actors who are kind of Resident Evil 1 bad voice acting, as in we've never even discovered a microphone before. What does this do? It's more so much I can imagine some very weary people having done, on take 200 of doing the same lines over and over and just delivering them, and then that kind of happening. Like some of the dialogue from some of the main characters is really poor, but then by comparison, a lot of the dialogue from kind of secondary or even tertiary characters who are just in the background or have very small roles actually is really spot on, is really, really solid. So I think it's possibly over polish and over direction, I suspect, is probably the answer.
It's funny that you say that because I have very similar thoughts. I don't even know if I guess it does have some highs. Sam Douglas, who plays Scott, is probably he's probably the only actor from it with any success outside of this game who's already established as an actor and continued to be successful. He's the high point. Everyone else for me was kind of mixed to poor, really. There was no overacting, but what it does have is... So I guess this game was made in France. I guess that's where the studio is based out of. So it's a lot of actors doing American accents, and most of the time it's fine. You don't really notice. On some characters it's totally plausible, like Blake and stuff like that. It's not too bad. Jaden, not too bad. And then occasionally you can almost hear the voice director demanding that they go from Midwestern America to the thickest of Queen's accents anytime anybody has to say origami killer, because they'll just be talking in a normal American accent and suddenly they have to go origami, and it's so distracting. And several characters do it, and it's not part of their natural accent. It's so distracting. I heard
it was hard origami said in so many different ways that I even forgot how to say it.
It's so distracting.
But I gotta pull you back on one thing, because Norman Jaden's accent wasn't bad. Norman Jaden.
I kind of find it. He's playing an FBI agent, so I kind of expected that. I guess, like a dumb cop accent.
Well, I did hear that the actor who portrayed him, Leon Ockenden, he basically just watched The Departed. So that makes sense. He just wanted to channel that. He wanted to channel Marky Mark and everyone else from that film. So yeah, it comes off as awkward.
Yeah, I think to be honest, there's always something where you need to channel and need to work to your strengths, right? If you have a bunch of French voice actors, set the thing in France.
Kinda, yeah.
If you have a bunch of American voice actors, set the thing in America. Mm-hmm. Like one or two gifted individuals who can do accents outside of their range, like Jean-Luc Picard's exceptional French accent in Next Generation, for example. Mm-hmm. That stuff is, or Sean Connery and his Russian accent in Hunt for October. if you could do some of that stuff, and obviously the classic of Tom Cruise in whatever the Valkyrie movie was, where his German accent is incredible. But outside of that, you can have one or two of those. But when you get to the point where it just sounds forced and weird, I think that's a point where in a game that's designed to be completely immersive and really make you feel like you are there watching this movie, playing through this thing, it just drags you straight back out again.
Exactly that. That happened to me
in this game.
Yeah, it happened to me multiple times. The worst one is in one of the flashback sequences near the end of the game. There's a child who just doesn't. They didn't even try to make them do an American accent. They have this really thick European accent, and it's so distracting, especially because they grow up to have an American accent. But never mind. Jordan, any more thoughts on the voice acting?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a strange one, really, because I feel like this game is a prime example of David Cage, who is obviously very ambitious as a game director. He is clearly very inspired by films, and he wants to transplant as much of that into gaming as possible, well, through his games at least. But this definitely feels like him stretching beyond his bounds, before he has the sort of almost the privilege to go to those bounds, because he'd made Fahrenheit, he'd made games before that as well, but made Fahrenheit, and that was all right. That was a success. Obviously, Heavy Rain ended up being a massive success, and it's been able to, fuel that vision that he has for interactive drama going forward. But there's a lot of teething issues. You hear about the way that production worked. Originally actors were told maybe about 15 days work, and it ended up being a couple years work, and they'd just be going back and forth between the UK or the US to the studio in Paris. And also the way that they actually managed to do the performance, because it was in 3 stages. So they do the facial capture with all the dots on the faces. So they would perform all their lines that way. Then they do it again in a studio, and that's when they will do the body capture. They'll have audio feedback of their facial capture, and they perform to that. So that's their cue, basically, to perform. In both of these sequences, typically the actors didn't actually have any other co-stars on set. It would be stand-ins, or it would be David Cage himself. And then finally, they go into the sound booth to do the final voiceover, which is then, that is done to the body capture. So each segment informs the next. And then they take that, they combine that, and then they composite it with the other performances by the other actors. So essentially, you've got them performing it 3 different ways, and then putting that all together, and then combining it with the performances of other actors who weren't even there. And I think that's probably even worse than the sort of issue with the casting of having a lot of non-Americans playing Americans. Because if they're not performing together, then you just don't have that chemistry.
Yeah.
I don't know how much that has changed for Quantic Dream. I imagine a lot, because obviously games around this time, like Uncharted, they were typically doing the performance in the mocap studio all at once. And what's more, they had the actors actually interacting with each other. So yes, there was actually less to make in the Uncharted games, but the chemistry worked a whole lot better because the actors were all on set, and that just wasn't the case here.
I had no idea. That actually, yeah, I mean, that kind of does explain a fair amount of character interaction in this game. I can say that much, definitely. Steve, what do you think of the voice acting?
It's okay. Like everyone else has said, it's a strange mishmash of quality, and some people, most of the child actors, not nailing the accents they are targeting. I want to put it down mostly to vocal direction, though, because I mean, with the right voice coach, I'm sure you can iron out a lot of these issues. It's strange though, because the line deliveries, it always feels like that's your best take. Or in some cases, I've heard that voice already 3 times for 2 different characters. In the case of Mad Jack, Paco, and the fellow who runs the convenience store. So reusing voice actors that sometimes, like in Paco's case, can be literally from Jaden's point of view, going from Mad Jack to Paco. It's peculiar for me, because obviously I get an ear for these kind of voices and things as it is. So yeah, serviceable for the era, but a solid D.
Fair. James, thoughts on the voice acting?
Yeah, the voice acting in this game is as dull as the environment. It's flat, and yeah, hearing Jordan say that, it makes sense, because it sounds like, one person says, "Hey," then the other person waits 10 seconds. "Hey," it's like it sounds like there's quality there, but it's just that there isn't. Yeah, like Steve said as well, the direction is bad, right? Because Shelby is so good. I actually really like his voice actor, and I really like his direction. And he's the only character, I think, other than maybe is it Miranda? Madison. Yeah. Other than Madison, who I liked a little bit, but Shelby was just the best character in the game in terms of voice direction, right? But everybody else is just flat, and I couldn't just kind of the story, which we'll get on later on. I couldn't follow. I couldn't get invested in these characters because they just didn't feel like they felt like caricatures of that character, not real. I couldn't be immersed, and you know how important that is for me. Like I couldn't, and it is for a lot of people. I just couldn't get immersed in that story. And every time someone would talk, I'd go to another scene. I was like, if I'd see it, it would be a particular person. Oh, there's one other person I want to talk about, but every time I see a particular person, such as Ethan, right, I'm like, you know, and he's like in a lot of the, he's the main character, one of the main characters. So I was like, oh, he's here again. All right, I'm gonna have to get bored for the next like 20-25 minutes listening to him. You know, be sad because, and then, you know, just content warning. I'm going to have to listen to him sad because his kid died. You know, and you know, oh, his kid and his other kid's gone missing. I should feel sad about that. I should feel upset about that, but I did not. Right, because he just sounds so flat. But another person who I think needs a little shout out as well is it Blake, Detective Blake?
Yeah.
Like he went overzealous, but like he was probably, other than Shelby, the only other person that had emotion,
Fair point.
that you could feel.
Yeah.
In this game. But yeah, I think I'll leave it there because I'll keep going on.
That's fair. You've brought us nicely to sort of the meat of this one. You know, it's important always to talk about visuals and audios for games. None more so than Heavy Rain, but the real meal of this podcast is definitely the story. So we have, I think, appropriately arrived at that point to give the briefest of overviews. And again, as with any of these podcasts, we are going to touch on spoilers. So if you haven't played the game and you're interested, you probably should do that. But, you know, otherwise, just roll right with us. The setup is there's 4 characters, and they are essentially all looking to solve the same revelation of the origami killer, a serial killer who seems to be kidnapping young boys whose bodies turn up a certain amount of time later, dead and appearing to be drowned, with a flower on their chest and this kind of thing. Out of the 4 lead characters, the one that you start off with, and arguably, I suppose, the main one of the 4, is Ethan, a father who famously, via the memes, loses his son Jason in a shopping mall, who then unfortunately dies in a traffic accident immediately outside of the shopping mall. And then, I think it's 2 years after that, his other son Sean also goes missing and is presumed kidnapped by this serial killer, and that's where it rolls from here. For me, I went through like sort of peaks and troughs of my interest. I really wasn't sure on this, but after the press X to Jason and press X to Sean scenes were over, that's when things started to have a little bit of intrigue. It's when the story started to roll. You know, all these 4 characters that were not connected necessarily, working towards the same thing, and eventually stories sort of starting to overlap. But it's funny that you said that, James, because I had absolutely the same reaction anytime Ethan's big giant face appeared on my screen denoting that he was the next character I was going to play as. I went, oh, here we go, back to Mopesville. And I should have cared. Of course I should have cared. He should be the most sympathetic story of the lot, but I was not that bothered. Out of all of them, I was interested-ish in Norman, and I was pretty interested in Scott. You know, his story has some sort of like LA noir almost to it, which would obviously come out like a year later, but sort of that was, being that this is kind of a detective story, him playing the private detective and the private eye, that's where I was like, oh, okay, you know, this is quite intriguing. Sherwin, how did you feel about, let's not necessarily touch on sort of like the endings and the reveals, but the story at large for Heavy Rain?
I liked the French version of Saw. I thought it was really interesting. No, do you know, I was very spoiled, I think, with a large part of this game. I'm not sure. I guess we'll talk about gameplay, such as it is, a little bit later on. So I'll kind of, I won't dive into too much of it now. I'll wait for that section. But honestly, I think the biggest problem I had with this, and the same as what you guys have said, is engagement. And I don't mean to be so negative, because I appreciate this is a game very much pushing the boundaries, and I really like that. Yeah, sometimes, or I really appreciate that sometimes games try to do that and they swing and they miss, and then something comes along later that kind of really, encapsulates that much better. I don't know. There's a lot of games out there that could exist if it wasn't for Heavy Rain, for example. But I think the biggest problem I've got with a lot of the story elements of this is that it's so cliche. It's really cliche in a lot of ways, and it deals with quite difficult subjects in only really the most basic surface level understandings of what it is. Like each one of these characters doesn't really feel like they are a character that could exist. They just feel like they are somebody who's turned up to deliver their wooden lines. That because that's very much a typecast thing. This person is the angry mother whose child has died. Bang, there you go. This person is the angry detective detective. Bang. This person is like the police chief who like turns up to kind of chat to the protagonist for a bit. I think that's the biggest part of this. It doesn't really feel like there's any depth, or these could actually be characters, or there's anything beyond those surface level interactions you have with any of them. And I think that comes through in the dialogue, and combine that with kind of the very dreary kind of visuals makes this really hard going at times to go through, as well as the disjointed nature of how a lot of the story elements rolled into each other. Like the amount of times where you find yourself just sitting there going, oh, well, so here's another one where someone's investigated something and turned up somewhere. Let's see what happens next. It's kind of, a lot of that stuff tends to really roll in. I'm not so sure it really flows very well, I guess is the way of saying it. And I'm not sure that the engagement is there as a result of that. So, but in terms of the actual main story arc and so on, again, I kind of said Saw. It feels a little bit like Saw was released that weekend, and someone went away and wrote this after watching that movie, or large parts of it. I'm not sure. I couldn't work out for a long while I was playing this whether it's because I genuinely don't really enjoy the type of genre that this normally fits into very much, and then ultimately came out of it thinking the reason I didn't engage with it is not because of the actual story or the actual the genre. It's because of the actual the interactions I have as a player. They just feel completely like dehumanized.
Yeah, so that's fair. It's funny because you talking about taking a swing and missing potentially, and something coming later to pick up the ball. Not to bring it back up again, but on our kind of recent episode about the original Resident Evil, we talked a lot about Alone in the Dark. And I don't want to dwell on it because we talked about it quite a lot. But it's almost kind of like that, where it's like that's the swing and the miss, and Resident Evil went, oh yeah, okay, we can do something way, way bigger and better than that. It's kind of like that. But also speaking of Alone in the Dark and of Saw, one thing I do like, I guess this is a David Cage thing, as previously mentioned, he does love his film. In the very Saw scene where Ethan has to take one of his fingers off, there was literally a saw on the floor. So it's obvious. Like, I mean, if it wasn't obvious enough, here's a big old flashing light. But I don't, the other references to film and video games in there, I actually kind of liked. I really like when directors and stuff kind of wear their influences on their sleeve, as long as they're not just directly copying something. But making a street, Carnaby Street, as a reference to Alone in the Dark was nice. At the end, there's a Blade Runner reference with, I think it's like Deckard Books or Deckard Publishing or something. Stuff like that. I thought it's not really part of the story, but I like little nods like that. Steve, what did you think of the story overall?
Oh, God, right. So I have the privilege of playing through this game twice, so I've suffered from what we might call the Fight Club effect, where you now know all the reveals, so it's a bit weird. As a result, I went about undermining the plans, or trying to, of certain characters to see if I could stretch the thing. We'll get there when we get there. And the game is so on rails that like, you wouldn't believe. You can't steer the train that much except for the fates of two characters initially. regarding the general thing, everyone keeps saying Saw. I keep seeing 7. I keep seeing 7
I could see
if
that.
Uwe Boll had the money of Hideo Kojima. You know, that's what I see. And fair play. I have played this is of the 3 David Cage games I've played. This is easily the worst. So I'm not like pulling any punches here, but yeah, Ethan is like a cardboard cutout of sad dad. You know, like easily the worst character named Ethan we've ever discussed on the podcast, bar none. You know, Ethan Winters says the word swear words a lot and other things, but apparently has a lot more character than Mr. Winters, despite the fact, Mr. Mars, despite the fact that Mr. Mars has literally lost one child and is in the process of losing another. Okay. Madison is treated like some kind of weird mishmash of a Deus Ex Machina and a sex object, and it kind of makes me feel very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I didn't even understand her entry point into the game for a long time. I couldn't work out if she just sort of turns up, and I kind of found myself going, right, what's your hook? Why are you here?
Yeah, I had the same reaction.
Like, are you a private detective? Are you somebody who actually is working for the FBI instead of weird glasses guy, which we must get onto at some point? Are we, you know, what's your entry point? You know, how do you fit as a character? And then you just discover, oh no, this is just female character who just decided that she's taking a real interest in Ethan for no apparent reason other than this really flimsy insomnia.
If you pursue the romantic relationship, because I wanted to do the cliche, she does reveal she's a journalist who's been like studying the case.
Mm-hmm. Too little too late at that point.
Yeah,
yes,
it's the 11th hour at this point, and it's she literally. This is going to sound so cool because she's literally the only female playable character in the game, and at the time was some kind of icon for it. And I can't see why. She feels like she's literally just there to be abused, beaten up, or yelled at, or to Deus Ex Machina a scene, and it makes me very uncomfortable.
Yes, I completely agree with that. I was going to sort of save my character takes for later, but while we're on the subject of Madison, I think she is like the most grey dishwater human being imaginable. Her first scene comes out of nowhere, makes no sense, leaves you with loads of questions that never get answered. As you mentioned, she does get revealed as a journalist later. But by that point, you've had hours of her just playing nurse to Ethan, which is not a great look for your only female character. But yes, of course, she can also have an obligatory shower scene, complete just like... It's awful.
During extraneous nightmare sequence that has no point in the actual narrative.
Yes, like she is needlessly exploited. It's just... It's so... Oh, God, it's so awful. Even her walk cycle is, like, needlessly exploitative. It's so bizarre. I hated her so much. Anyway, Steve, sorry, please, carry on.
Yeah.
Can I add on to that?
Go for it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to be a little bit controversial here, but they didn't treat female characters very well at all in this game.
Yeah.
Like, because, I mean, just quickly, the wife in this game of Ethan is a complete tosser. Like, she's not nice.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and there's no reason for it. Like, she just isn't.
Yeah, she's like, how could you let this happen? Blah, 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 blah.
But it's not, I mean, yeah, there's that. But that's it's just right at the beginning. She's just not a nice person to Ethan.
Yelling at you about plates.
For no reason. I mean, to be honest, you know, I also wouldn't be very nice to Ethan if he just spoke to me like that, like all the time, you know, but to be honest, he also wouldn't be my husband.
In fairness, in defense of Ethan, it can't be easy being that wooden.
I think that poor Ethan, no, I should say his wife is the poor one here. Like, right at the start of the game, we're introduced to the point where she arrives home and says, hey, all our kids' friends are coming over. I've got literally so much to do. Can you please help me? Kids are outside playing in the garden, so they'll be fine. He goes, no worries. I'll spend 10 minutes putting out plates and then just go play with the kids in the garden. Walk off and leave you to try and do everything. It really is bad husbandry at that point.
It's funny you mentioned Grace, though, because, I mean, she has, like, one line of pivotal dialogue to the plot when it starts, and it pretty much rockets the police in one direction they won't let go of. That's her entire purpose for being. very utilitarian, one might say. Regarding the other characters, I think Scott stand out as the the massive reveals of the story revolves on. I think we'll try and hinge on that for 2 minutes. And Nam and Jaden of the FBI, despite feeling almost as superfluous as Madison, has probably the most appeal for Steve because, one, they're a crackhead trying to be a police officer, and it's just funny. And I think it was a 0 punctuation that was on Heavy Rain describing him as, if you take it as every time he has a trip, he's somehow altered the future. It somehow makes him work so much more interesting as a character, as a time traveler who's breaking his brain to solve the case. And I would happily play a game with just him as the main character. Everyone else could go jog. Which is strange because they literally have like almost no threatening presence, and they have to do the most like dangerous work of the entire game.
James, how do you feel about the story overall?
Don't like it, Si.
Okay.
Job done. That's it. Just leave it there. Move on.
It's what in the gaming community we would call cookie cutter, right? It's meta, and it's kind of that meme of how multiple choice video games are actually not multiple choice. They're just like, here's 3 decisions, and they just go to one decision, and then 3 decisions again, and it's always this one same decision. I always felt that way, other than some character deaths, which, to be honest, I didn't care about the story, so it didn't really have any, we'll talk about it more later, but it didn't really have any consequence for me. I didn't care because I didn't care about the story. And, I should have cared a little bit more about Shelby's story, but I just didn't because it wasn't told well. Someone mentioned earlier on about a lot of this, it just felt disjointed and just, Sherwin, you were talking about, sorry, what was the name again?
Madison.
This is going to happen a lot, okay? Madison just like, plop, here she is. Like, this was just happening a lot, and you just get teleported around. Like, there's a bit towards the end where, like, I laughed out loud when this happened. She's in a fridge, and then the place blows up, and suddenly she's outside. She's the fridge has given birth to her outside the building. And I just like, how did this happen? And there's like a lot of instances like right at the beginning, right? What's Grace? Grace, the wife, she says to Ethan, go upstairs, go see what Sean's doing. Sean or Jason, I'm not sure at this point. And he's like, Merlin died. And you're like, Merlin? Who's the bird? Merlin's died. And you're like, I killed Merlin. And then Ethan's like, you didn't so-and-so something philosophical line, and I was like, but what did we learn from that scene? And how did it happen?
Right, what actually happened to the bird? You didn't ask!
What we learned, James, is that Ethan's children are just as wooden as he is.
So was that bird, apparently. The bird is the best actor of the entire game. Okay, that's it.
Played dead superbly.
Can I just jump in for 1 second? Did it? How much did it take you out when you had to be a good dad at the park before all stuff kicks down? Because the nature of young Sean Maher's emotional range is terrifying. He can go from hating his dad and thinks he's the worst person ever to the child who is happiest and most content in life on a dime. It's weird watching the child go into emote mode and then off again and then back again.
It's like an episode of Black Mirror or something.
Yeah.
Also, have you guys ever used a boomerang? Did you see the size of that park?
Yeah, there's no way that went well the first time. As someone who has used a boomerang, that no way that happened. The kid pulled it off straight away as well. No.
Yeah, that's killing kids on the way back. That's a whole nother story. That would have made it way more interesting.
Jordan, how did you feel about the story then?
Oh, you're all going to make me defend this story far more than
Only
I
if
ever
you
planned
want.
to. Far more than I ever planned to. But I think it's important to sort of understand certain context of the production, that so much was cut. Obviously, there's a lot of plot holes with regard, or well, not sort of plot holes, but more sort of absences of character motivations or backstory, and that is in part because they either cut the content with the intention of releasing it as DLC afterwards, or I don't know, maybe other stuff just ended up on the cutting room floor with no other reason or intention of releasing it or bringing it back. But I think it's weird because I feel like there's fragments of a story here that can work. While I understand that, like, Ethan's wife, comes off as erratic and just generally not very sympathetic. At the same time, like, I also understand the dynamic that shared grief over the loss of a child can seriously damage relationships. And yeah, I've seen plenty of great shows that kind of explore that. Kidding is a great show for that, but it's obviously it's limited by how long the story is, so you don't get to explore that whatsoever. There's a lot of things that happen to Ethan Mars in between the accident and when we then pick it back up. When he's with Sean at his new house. He's been in a coma for a period of time. He's moved. Presumably, he's lost his job, and obviously, he's estranged from his wife. And what's more, one of the biggest sequences that would give insight into a lot of Ethan's character throughout this game was completely scrapped. He's meant to have a more psychological side to his game. Originally, the plan was that he was going to have some kind of mind link with Scott Shelby, where when Shelby would commit his crimes, it would actually cause the blackouts that Ethan has, which then lead to him having whole sequences, which he wakes up with a new origami piece in his hand. Now,
can I just say that this whole plot line that has been axed, right, is a major bugbear for me, because I feel like it would have helped the story move along a lot better for at least Ethan, because, yeah, as Jordan's going to go on to, like, those scenes right now feel like they're just cutting room bits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But absolutely, those pieces play into his guilt and his paranoia. The fact of the matter is that he thinks he's the killer, and I don't know about you guys, but I never thought he was the killer. It seemed kind of outlandish to think that that he was capable of that. But we haven't went through the same experience that the character did, and because that's not shown to us or conveyed in any kind of way, we just can't understand that, and it comes off as just a gaping hole in the story. So there's problems like that. Madison Page, I fully agree that in the actual game she doesn't come across well at all, because she just sort of shows up. She has that traumatic nightmare, and then for whatever reason she's crossing paths with all of the other characters, and she's very invested in trying to figure out this case, and we don't necessarily have that inciting incident that properly brings her into it. I mean, the original plan for her character was that she was a war correspondent, and that's where her night terrors come from. So again, it's a lot of missing context. So in part, I'm defending the game for, well, this is the reason why it comes off so janky and holes all over it like Swiss cheese. But at the same time, yes, I completely understand that it can't be enjoyed if you don't understand why people are doing things. I mean, as far as sort of the pace of the game, obviously the first time I tried to play it, I gave up just because it's very slow in the beginning, and yeah, every scene that goes back to Ethan seems to be more increasingly depressing. I mean, that whole sequence where you've got to basically do the routine for Sean, make sure he's ate by a certain time, make sure he's in bed by a certain time. And if you mess that up, the next scene that you have with Ethan, they're guilting you about it. Oh, the teacher yelled at him because he showed up late, or was falling asleep in class or something like that.
Yeah.
It's just like, man, it's like these are the kind of consequences that are not fun in the game. They just really kind of bring you down.
It's
but
like
I would say that
version of The Sims.
The plot does feel like it picks up a pace by, I think, the second trial. Once you're at that stage, I felt like just about every scene had something to it that was pushing things on. And at that point as well, you were getting a pretty decent rotation of the characters. So it never felt like you were in one place for too long. But yeah, there's holes all over the place. Some for understandable reasons, some for not understandable reasons. There's not a lot of depth to the characters. I think even if David Cage had been given a greater budget or more time and to make it a 15 or 20 hour game on a typical run, he still wouldn't necessarily be able to effectively explore all of the subject matter that he wants to, because as you guys say, it's very heavy subject matter, and tackling even one of them would be a big undertaking in a video game. But to tackle many of them at the same time, it's tough. I mean, with regards to the characters, it's weird. It's like if you could combine certain elements of all four of them, you could almost have a complete character that you could kind of root for and understand and follow along. But I felt like they were all missing something. I mean, Ethan Mars, it kind of feels like the default character. He feels like the one that you should be kind of like following centrally. But I don't think he has an arc. It doesn't feel like he has an arc. It's
not really. It's more of a straight line.
Yeah. It's kind of, he's able to save, his son this time, but really that should be sort of like bare minimum. I was kind of hoping that through the trials his character would change and he would be emboldened, and he would be able to kind of, believe in himself again. Because, I mean, he is at the absolute, pit of despair. He's suicidal and depressed, and it doesn't necessarily change that much. And what's more, if you don't necessarily do very well in the game, he can have horrible ends. So that he wasn't necessarily fun to play as and feel that I was going anywhere. I'd say the only character that does feel like they have some kind of arc to an extent is Norman Jayden trying to overcome his addiction on it. Was it Triptocaine?
Yeah.
But even then, that is a very light arc. That is side service to the story, really. It doesn't have a great deal of weight to it. So as far as the actual story itself, I understand why it is the way it is. I would say that I probably enjoyed it more for the actual involvement with the game controls and the action set pieces and sequences. But if that is the biggest take from this game, then by David Cage's own virtue, it's probably failed. Because he's trying to pull you in to the actual writing and the storytelling, and it's literally not all there.
I'm actually really glad that you did that research, because I had no idea, and that it does explain a lot. They talk about the 2,000-page script this game had, and even with all the slightly different versions of scenes or whatever, and the number of endings, it doesn't feel hugely expansive. And now it kind of explains that some of those pages obviously didn't come to the final game, I guess. There's a lot of stuff. There's bits that we touched on that don't really have a major impact on the story. Each of the four characters have like a major flaw, like as you mentioned, Norman's addiction to Triptocaine, Madison's insomnia, and Ethan's blackouts that goes absolutely nowhere, which now, as we understand, should have been more. I did think that maybe he was the killer immediately after having that, Sean goes missing, he has a blackout. I thought, oh, okay, he's got the origami in his hand. But obviously, the further you go into the game just tells you outright. There is a scene where Ethan says he thinks he's the killer or whatever, which, if they'd have explored that more, definitely could have been interesting, but it just felt thin like everything else. If there was more time for that, then sure, the mystery of that would be more interesting. The only one that's remotely good is Scott's asthma that he has, which in a flashback, if you're paying close attention, you'll realise who a certain character is, because they're also huffing and puffing as they run around. But we'll get to that kind of stuff. Let's talk a little bit more characters before we close up the story section, since we've touched on it a bit. I'm in agreement that David Duchovny Light, aka Norman, because he pretty much just looks like he should have come out of X-Files. He is one of the better characters. You know, his addiction storyline was quite interesting, and how you could at points decide whether or not you were going to take that drug. Same with Scott. I just found it easier to be invested in a character in this sort of police role, actually investigating a crime, rather than Ethan, who is just going through the trials. As you said, though, once you're in the thick of the trials, that's the most interesting part, but it doesn't really feel like he's growing as a character. It doesn't feel like it's going anywhere except going down a shopping list of bad stuff. I'm not really that sorry that I wound up putting him in jail, my bad. Scott was definitely the best one for me, which obviously it all falls apart when we get to the revelation. Sherwin, any standout or least favourite characters for you?
I think we've said a lot about Ethan, and I don't think I really need to add anything about Ethan other than that I agree. I think I think none of the characters. I think all of the characters presented in this game are just presented in a way that you just don't resonate with any of them. The closest you have is Shelby, and that's really because, again, of the fact that the actual voice actor has more emotive range than all of the others. But even then, it feels difficult to kind of really connect with that too much. But I think special call out does have to go to Jaden, which Jaden is a character which doesn't work on such a monumental scale that I literally just laughed through every single section of the game that I was in. It just tears you so far from the gritty reality or the focus of the rest of the game in terms of this is something which is about psychological trauma. It's very realistic, or at least in its own way, it kind of tries to be super realistic about a man's depression and everything else, and it tries to be very much rooted and grounded. And the only comparative moment in any video game I can really think of is when Ada whips out her secret agent gun, and the whole Resident Evil 2 remake really just takes a nosedive. It's the closest. It's the closest I can say to that. It's that moment where I suddenly just step back from the screen and I'm like, okay, so this bro's got like some special glasses that let him see into the artificial reality world. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm at that point, at that early stage in the game, I've checked out. At this point, mostly because honestly, I look at that and I see where they were probably going with this, and just felt, you know what, if you just gave this guy a coke addiction, then it would be so much more realistic, and you could still achieve everything you wanted to do with this, with like the guy struggling with an actual drug addiction. You still could have had mechanically the bit where you're looking for clues and sort of digging through your memory for files or something. You don't need to have a section where he walks into an office and then decides he wants to use the surface of Mars or whatever as a background, and then starts pulling files out of the ether. You could just have a filing cabinet. Like,
yeah, kind of.
If you've gone as far as making Dad Simulator 2003 or whatever it was, this game came out 2010. If you've gone as far as making Bad Dad Simulator 2010, then you can do like Bad Cop Simulator 2010 as well, and have him go through filing cabinets and looking for stuff.
Yeah. Lest we forget, Minority Report came out 8 years before this, so it was a bit of a dated reference.
Yeah, it's not a great. I just found that just so bad. And yeah, I mean, in terms of the other characters, I mean, again, it's Madison we talked about just doesn't really seem to have any purpose or any connection whatsoever for a very long time. Ethan is, as we've said, extremely dull, and just it's very easy to drop out of any sympathy for him in any way, shape, or form. I think I think the sheer doggedness of wooden script and delivery and the sort of chop change sort of style of it, as well as the fact that, as I've said again, the characters just don't really connect as anything other than really stereotypical scripted interactions, and don't really appear to have much depth to them, is a real barrier to me really engaging with a lot of them. But again, Jaden just does stand out as that one that made me care about how laughable it was.
Love that. Cool. Unless anybody has any other character notes.
Yeah, one thing I hate about movies and stuff is, but movies have kind of got better with it recently, right? Is when stuff is drawn out, and there was a bit where you're trying to get to know the name of the kid the other son from the granny in the hospital.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And she's like, she said like 8 or 9 times. It's like, I don't know, I have only one son, and then she's like, come closer, and you're like, oh, god damn it, grandma, come on, and then nothing is said. It's whispered. And you're like, oh, what?
Yeah.
Another immersion breaking
And the
moment.
reaction.
Yeah.
The reaction she has, despite the fact you never see said characters together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was definitely Ethan then. I was right all along. Oh no, nope, can't be. It's nonsense.
But yeah, it's there was a verbal reaction from me when that came out. Right, I was like, come on. Right, it's like, that is stupid. That is, I am an amateur writer, and like when I look at that, and I'm like, I got mad. I was like, come on, that's dumb. Anyway, yeah.
I've been complaining a lot about this game, like throughout the entirety of this podcast. So I'm
we
going
all
to just give
have,
it I'm going to get a little bit of praise, right? And this is more the first time because I went out of my way to sabotage it the second time. The Scott Shelby reveal, the fact that you've been gathering evidence to cover your own tracks the entire time, and the fact the only reason you're investigating the case is to kill a copycat is pretty good. I thought it was actually decent. As much as I prefer Nam and Jaden, I thought the thrust of that arc and the fact that you are so manipulative and so downright evil to these people, and your warm, kind-hearted PI routine is actually complete and utter crap. To the point that when I was playing this playthrough for the podcast, I literally went out of my way to make sure he got shot, beaten up, and any possible way I could mess it up for him, I did. That might speak levels to my time-traveling vindictiveness. I am not sure. The worst part is you can completely fluff his final, out-of-character, up until this point, shootout with Gordy Kramer's goons, and he just leaves. There's no big payoff, just I've been shot 4 times, right, I'll see myself out, I'll get the coat. I was gutted at that.
Can we just take a silent appreciation moment? And this is much like in the same as Steve. I'm going to say a really positive thing now. There has never been a character in the history of mankind that can draw a straight line quite the same way as Ethan can. Those things are incredible. They are dead straight, just straight line from scratch. No wavering, nothing else. When you're drawing your when you're drawing your picture at the start, those lines are incredible.
Speak for yourself. My Ethan just threw all the paper in the bin and gave up.
Oh, okay.
And then he went about his day clanging plates on the table and generally being useless.
I mean, just quickly, because we're all giving praise, I want to, because I'm going to be pretty scathing for my summary when we get past gameplay, but the animations, the 3 animations we see are pretty cool. I did research them a little bit. The first one you see that Sean is watching at the beginning is called Pyrats. Pyrats. The second one during the interrogation is called Voodoo, and the last one was called, I think, Coquette Minute or Coquette Minette. And then one of them, I couldn't find the others, or they might all be made by Goblins of Art, which is a French animation studio. But they were so much fun to watch. They were great.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's a nice little detail to actually put something on the TV that isn't just pixelated mess, like a looping animation. So yeah, no, I agree with that. And Steve, I kind of agree with the reveal, the Scott Shelby reveal. The idea that he's been going around destroying evidence and stuff was quite interesting when it happened. When the reveal was made that he was the origami killer, I had to say I was massively disappointed. It seemed like, not to use a wrestling terminology, swerve for swerve's sake. It just comes so far out of nowhere, and technically doesn't even really make any sense. He's never, and Jordan, I don't know if there's any like cut stuff that you can illuminate on this, and I'll throw it to you in a moment, but I don't. Maybe he's schizophrenic. Maybe he was meant to be a schizophrenic character, because in this game, not to talk too much about gameplay, but if you hold down, I think one of the left triggers or whatever, you get a bunch of choices of different thoughts you can hear. And I guess Scott's convinced himself that he's not the killer, because all of his thoughts are about finding the killer. Yeah, okay, at a stretch, the copycat killer. But it just doesn't seem to jive with the revelation when you've been hitting all those thought bubbles that I got. And, you know, when it came out, it was just so unbelievable that he was the killer. I guess he makes a cool bad guy, but it crashed and burned for me. I think the end is really a mess.
I mean, I like the reveal, but cool bad guy is way too much praise.
Not a cool bad guy, but I thought it was an interesting idea, just terribly executed. Especially because, at least in my playthrough, it really wants you to think that it's Blake, Norman's partner. You can apparently there's a scene where I looked this up. You can accuse him of being the killer, but it turns out that's not the case, and you've wasted your time. And he's not involved. There's a scene beforehand when Norman's looking at his files, and he says that's why he's so keen to pin it on someone, as if to say, "Oh, Blake's trying to pin it on Ethan because Blake's the real killer." Maybe he's covering for Scott Shelby because they kind of imply they know each other, but they never really address that at all. It's so weird. The end's a mess. The end's a mess, basically. So the ending that I got, just to wrap it, was Ethan went to jail and the other two characters met up to stop Scott, and he died. Steve, go ahead.
It turns out, Carter Blake is in fact just horrendously incompetent. They're not.
No, yeah, he's just an asshole.
I mean, when you think about it, right, okay, Ethan comes in, the first time goes, right, okay, my kid's been missing. What's the first thing he says? Oh, I'm sure it'll be fine. Literally having the previous night found a body from the origami killer. And then not only with Ethan holding an origami figure in his hand, and then the second that Ethan's wife goes, yeah, it's Ethan did it. He's doggedly pursuing him like it's the fugitive. Complete with homage to the fugitive that just doesn't work because he just jumps off a roof and not down a stop. Oh God, don't get me started. I didn't kill my wife. Sorry, Harrison Ford. Yeah, I love that film. Right, okay. What was I saying? Yeah, Carter Blake, idiot.
Yeah, fair. Jordan, do you have any insight into the ending and what did you think of it personally?
Well, yeah, you were hoping that maybe I could give some kind of context that would maybe further explain or embolden the whole idea of Scott Shelby being the origami killer.
I feel there's nothing. Yeah.
Not that anything that I could find. I mean, it's a weird one, really. I mean, I'll say this as a little extra piece of trivia is that David Cage has said that two of the films that he was inspired by when coming up with the story, and trying to sort of make something of a serial killer mystery. Two films that he was inspired by was Seven, as we mentioned earlier on the podcast, and also Bong Joon-ho's Memories of Murder. And he said in particular he liked the idea of a story or a mystery that doesn't necessarily have a satisfying resolution, as in you don't necessarily find out who the killer is. Or they get away. And to an extent, that's being achieved by having somebody, who's effectively hiding in plain sight, like Scott Shelby, as the killer and as the twist. And it's almost clever, but it takes a mental leap to make it work. So if you got a clock near you got a watch or something like that, try and count 13 seconds, because 13 seconds is what is required to make this work, because obviously there's a big plot hole or a seeming plot hole when Scott and is it Lauren? Go to the typewriter store, and then Manfred's killed. Manfred's killed. That whole sequence, he goes to the back to look for a lodger, and then all of a sudden he's killed. He's been bludgeoned to death. That whole thing takes place in 13 seconds, and we're to believe that it was Scott Shelby doing that, despite the fact he was in the other room with Lauren. We're expected to believe that because Lauren was looking at an ornament for 13 seconds, and he ran into the back, smacked Manfred, came back out, and went, "I wonder where Manfred is," and then went back in. And also called the police. Now, look, I don't know how old Scott Shelby's meant to be, but that is a lot to do for even Usain Bolt to do in 13 seconds. Run in, kill someone, call the cops, run back out, and wonder what's going on. It's strange, and it's weird because Fahrenheit had something that probably would have been compelling to use in Heavy Rain, because in Fahrenheit, the game opens with you as one of the characters who, I'm not going to go into it, but through some kind of possession, randomly kills a man in a bathroom, and then has to quickly hide the evidence. He doesn't understand what he's done, but he is basically a killer at large. And the other characters that you are then introduced to, the other characters that you play as, are the detectives trying to figure out who the killer is. And as such, through your actions, you can actually mess with their investigation and kind of almost throw them off the trail. Can't speak for the full length of the game because I haven't beaten it, but that was at least where I got to. And the funny thing is, that would have been really suitable for this game. The idea that you already know who the killer is, and you can almost kind of pit the people trying to investigate it versus the actual criminal perpetrating it. But obviously that wasn't the case, and the game is deliberately trying to throw you off that scent by making Scott Shelby seem like a completely separate individual. I mean, I've got nothing to prove it, but the nightclub scene when Norman Jayden actually finds the origami killer, I swear he's a different size compared to when they flash back to that scene later on.
Yeah, I think you're probably right.
Let's be honest. Scott Shelby, he's a big guy. He cuts a big figure, even if he is in a Mr. X trench coat and hat. I feel like that would have been obvious if it was Scott Shelby. I mean, I'll be honest. I already knew he was the killer because I'd had it spoiled for me years ago, so it wasn't like a big revelation playing through the game. But I kind of, for that reason, when it came to the reveal, I was just kind of like, it is a bit weak. So in that respect, yeah, it didn't work so well. But as far as my ending, it was all right. It was kind of like half good. I'd managed to complete enough of the trials to be able to locate Sean as Ethan. And I was able to rescue him without me taking the poison. So at least they end up together. Madison Page, she and Ethan have the romance, so they end up together and they get a new place, and that's all happy in that. Scott Shelby gets away, and Norman Jayden dies because I messed up on like the second to last sequence. It's so annoying. So you have that whole warehouse fight sequence, and they're outside and they're on that big conveyor belt that's going up, and there's a whole sort of like Donkey Kong segment where Scott Shelby's throwing a bunch of crap and Norman Jayden's got to try and dodge it. And then I thought I was doing it. I was like doing all of the motions, and then it got to, he picked up a hammer and he threw that, and then that was it. Norman Jayden was out, and I thought it was a fake out at first because I was like, well, I had something similar happen with Madison Page earlier in the game. I thought, oh no, he'll come back, and no, he just fell to his death, and Scott Shelby got away. So boy. Yeah, I kind of felt a little bit kind of, but I was like, well, at least I didn't get any kind of like the bad Ethan endings, because I went back and had a look at those, and man, some of those are depressing.
There's a perfect one in the graveyard with Madison. Oh my god.
So yeah, that was my endings, but in general, yeah, I'm not quite bowled over by the twist of the killer.
Yeah, I didn't even you said something about poisoning. I've no idea. I didn't even get that far. With Ethan, I failed the electric maze puzzle, and he cowardly went through the coward door, which let me continue playing. It didn't stop or anything after that. But where I fell down was quite literally when the rooftop chase is when I got hauled into jail, and that was the last scene from Ethan. But he gets released at the end because the other two characters put Scott away. So his ending, like the character and like the story himself, for me was kind of boring. Steve, what endings did you get?
Yeah, I got the perfect rose tinted ending this time because I went all in on sabotaging Shelby. Everyone, Jaden kicked his habit, some remnants of the ARI still in his eyes. I went for the cliche Hollywood bit with Madison and Ethan. But it turns out, just spoilers for everyone who does all of the trials, the poison that's meant to rob Ethan of his life in an hour is the fake out. It's just syrup. Or, Shelby, for some reason, has a blind spot for poison and can't get it right because that doesn't kill him. He's perfectly fine. Which is, considering the amount of harrowing stuff he puts Ethan through, a bit of an oversight, just saying. Because some of those trials, my fellow listeners, are downright horrific. It was fine. Honestly, they all live happily ever after. Sean seems to like his dad again, despite, really being left in a storm drain for 4 days. I'd be a bit miffed.
Fair.
It's kind of meh. I have seen the other endings, and, it's worth seeking them out for the level of cringely awfulness ones there are. Although, if you do go about what I would consider almost a perfect book note ending, is if you were to sabotage everyone except Scott, but make sure Lauren survives, it's the most perfect twist because, he's obviously been leading everybody on, but he's trying to catch the killer and undermines everything. And then she just appears from nowhere, having Deus Ex Machina'd the entire plot herself, despite not being around for most of it, and just shoots him, which is poignantly grim. Doing it the way it's meant to be intended for the big Hollywood ending feels almost like a cop-out when you can see some levels of completely awful written dialogue. It's hard to convey, really, but you should seek them out. Especially the one where Madison proposes to Ethan over their son's grave to have another child. And Ethan reacts a bit.
I've mostly avoided looking at them, to be honest. I knew about the Lauren kills Scott ending, but I was like, I'm going to watch them after we're done recording because I kind of just want to hear people's interpretations before I seek them out myself. James, what endings did you get?
I got exactly the same one as Jordan.
Okay.
Yeah, I got Norman. I missed the QTE on the hammer, and I watched Jordan. Sorry, I watched Norman for a good 15 seconds go down this conveyor belt into the grinder at the end. And I also like that poison as well. Like he took poison and said, and he was like, "Just know I love you, son," or something. And then it didn't work. It was just cowpole or something.
It's so much better if they get out the door after everything's resolved and then the poison works. As an actual twisted payoff. Or oh no, it's just maple syrup.
And and Shelby still walking the streets. After that, but again, by that point in the game, I was not invested at all, so I didn't really care either way. But I was surprised that Sean didn't die of hypothermia after being in that storm drain for 4 days or whatever it was. He was in there for so long. He should have been a prune. I don't understand how he was still alive. Exactly the same ending. I was the same as you, Si. I haven't actually looked into the endings at all. I was going to wait until after the podcast to have a look into them and make some tweets about them.
Excellent. So apparently there's 17 endings. I did a Google. Wow. I did a Google for how long the game is before I played it, and then I curiously just wanted to know how many endings there were. I don't know if that's strictly true because really it's you got 4 characters and they each have numerous different endings, so it's different combinations really is what it looks up. Once you've done it, obviously these are different endings, like different epilogues, scenes get placed in your little movie viewer, so you can play it a few more times and get different ones and have them all unlocked to view. So I strictly don't know how many actual configurations of endings there are, but nonetheless, Sherwin, what did you think of the end and what endings did you achieve?
Everyone died, man. The only way of saying it. Let's see. Madison got killed by the crazy old dude.
Crazy old dude.
Oh man, the doctor.
Oh yeah. Jeez.
Oh,
Forgot
yeah.
about that.
What's the fetish scene? Jesus.
Yeah. So she never made it out, which is unfortunate. This also meant that Ethan killed himself unorthodoxly, but Ethan didn't make it out. Ethan got captured and went to prison, but at that point, Jaden was also dead because he got killed by Shelby. So
incredible.
Sorry?
That's incredible.
So that didn't happen, and to be fair, so had my interest in the game had also died at this point. So it kind of worked out in its own way. And then my reward at the end is that for being good enough to romance Lauren meant that she shot me. So it was all good. Happy time around, really.
Beautiful.
Yeah. I think honestly, I mean that scene probably stands out, especially as just being one of the most wooden scenes I've ever seen in my entire life. But if anything, but I think honestly the game is the endings. I think the problem with the endings is that some of them are there's some really heavy subjects like suicide in there, and they just feel so much like you asked a 16-year-old kid to write a story of a suicide at the end. Like, they don't really weigh at all in terms of the mental trauma that a character might have gone through to get to that point or whatever else. It's like a haphazard thing that's just thrown in. That really resonated with me a lot, like in terms of looking at the endings and seeing what, the amount of ways that Ethan kills himself, for example. And so much of that just feels like it's just literally the most cursory kind of, we just kill himself at the end. Why not? That seems like an ending to fit this. Or whatever else. Like, it just feels very much like it's a token gesture in a lot of these things, and none of that necessarily sits very well. But I think honestly the answer is that the endings feel flat, but that's mostly because the whole game's narrative feels quite flat.
Yeah.
And I think that's why they don't really resonate or anything. It's kind of, they're just a series of miserable endings for a game that's made itself to be as miserable as possible, with most of the different choices for the colors, for the story arc, for the acting, for everything else. So
yeah, that's fair. I mean, I was one of the people that managed to off the killer at the end, and I certainly didn't feel like I had any great sense of achievement or resolve for it. So even with the massive difference in the way that our stories ended, I do agree with that. Let's talk finally about the way the game controls. As I mentioned at the top of the show, there is a move addition. It was sort of designed with motion controls in mind, at least at some point. I couldn't help feeling at several points in the game that perhaps it would be better with the move controller for immersion's sake, and also would it just be easier, because it's a game of many QuickTime events, a lot of which is essentially just trial and error the way they throw them at you. I found it hard to know whether certain ones would tap a lot or hold them down. I know they all had different symbols, but I just found memorizing the different style of box kind of difficult. It wouldn't sit in my brain, so I had lots of issues where I was like, well, failed that, I guess I'll hurriedly try and do it another way to see if I can get out of it, that kind of thing. Some of them felt okay to do, stuff where you're using like one side of your body, so all of them are, or like the left triggers and on the D-pad, or on the right side of the body is on the face controls and the right triggers. Like that felt okay, but mostly I didn't enjoy the way that it played. And just getting head around the walking controls at the beginning, I felt like, after the first 10 minutes, I wondered if I was going to make it through the whole game until I picked up the walking controls, because they just felt so unnatural. Holding down R2 to walk my
I'm gonna
character
say-
was just hugging walls and spinning on the spot until I figured out what it wanted me to do.
I'll tell you how you don't improve tank controls, ladies and gentlemen. You don't give them a bloody accelerator.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. I was like, oh, it's kind of like Resident Evil, but everything's wrong about it. Brilliant. Right? Everyone says tank controls are outdated and terrible, but this, I don't know. As a tank control player, I just found this so hard to get my head around at first. Steve, what did you think of the controls and the gameplay at large?
generally, I was okay, but I've played like Shenmue and so many other QTE
Sure.
games. I'm pretty much indestructible. The only ones that kind of caught me off guard were the ones where you either had to be a little slower or you had to swing the controller. Like that, the actual moving the controller in a direction and stuff, half the time it just wouldn't register. It might be the quality of my pad. Realistically speaking, it is an old busted PS3 pad that's been through its fair share of abuse. And I'm not even one of these people who throws a controller in frustration. The only other things were a case of me feeling thick for when it's a hold button and release QTE. The amount of times though where it's got this QTE heavy sequence and you can intentionally fluff it up and it still goes ahead, I'm just like, why even have it then?
Yeah.
Why not just have a movie without the X button, circle, and triangle prompts constantly filling up the screen?
Yeah, I definitely have a point to make about that, but carry on.
Otherwise, it's fine. I've played worse. I think the way the action's done in this game is a lot better than its predecessor. Because in the QTEs in Fahrenheit were literally like, analog stick based in the middle of the screen. There were multicolors. And this, in this case, of it, in the way the attack is going, which is where a lot of people are going to focus in the eye, is the button prompt. That makes sense. If it wasn't cut together like, Michael Bay's been taking LSD. Because a lot of the fights seem about as cluster as like a Transformers fight in a Michael Bay film. Just replace it with a boring man in a trench coat and a dude with a bad haircut.
Yeah, fair point. James, what did you think of the gameplay?
I played on the PC this time round. It is on Steam right now. And I felt like the mouse controls, because a lot of it is just sliding, right? The mouse controls are pretty good, to be honest. But again, an entire game made of QTE events made an already bland game even more bland. And like there was a point, again, another time that I verbally I went, ugh, as an ace person, having to go through a sex scene with QTEs was the most awkward thing I've ever done. Like there was this point where they were trying to kiss and I kept on missing, so they were doing this thing where they were just like going in and then out and then in and then out, while trying to kiss each other. It was so weird.
I didn't even know that was a thing. That sounds awful.
It was terrible. But yeah, but other than that though, like the mouse controls were pretty good actually. In terms of how they reacted. I just didn't like the matter of the game that it was in, like in the fact I was doing it all the time. It was just for a lot of repetitiveness. And I have to agree with you also, side that I didn't know whether to smash a button, hammer it, spam it, keep it held in. I didn't know because they're all very similar. The symbols were. In terms of the gameplay and how the characters move, the body moves first and then the head follows. It was so strange. It was so Exorcist every time it would happen. It just felt like sprockets and bolts are just going to pop out of their necks. So moving around. But there was also a bit where I almost fell asleep, and I shouldn't have, because it was a super. To be honest, almost fell asleep a few times for this game, but this was the worst time. It was going through that freaking vent with glass in it. How long did that have to be?
Yeah.
Like, it was like a full 2.5 minutes, maybe more, of just crawling through here. And I was like, oh, is this going to end at any point?
Can I give you a nice 11th hour reveal for that bit, in case in case listeners are still playing, right, or what have you? You don't even need to slow down for that bit. The game will scare you into doing that. Just go full speed. Just rip him apart.
Of course. Yeah, of course. Of course, that's the way.
But yeah, the PC controls, if you like QT events, it works well on the PC, but yeah, I don't really like, a game that's full of QTE events.
I'm just blown away. I didn't even know it were on PC. I had to play it on PS3. Oh, like, what?
Yeah.
When did this happen?
I think it's only at $5 right now as well.
That's a bit overpriced.
You get about you get like 6-7 hours out of it. That's £1. Over £1 an hour. That's pretty good. Value for money, guys.
Sorry.
I'll have a summary later on, but the gameplay. That's how I feel.
Sherwin, how did you feel about the gameplay?
I'm gonna jump in on this one. I think, into its defense, yes, it's not terribly intuitive in some places, but I think I found this quite straightforward, and that might well be because I've played an awful lot of Detroit Become Human, which is very, very, very similar. I do think that the beginning parts of the game are very, very, very tedious. Because, and I can understand why, it is a necessary game for basically introducing this style of what the game is, because it takes something that I don't know. Quick time events were first introduced in Shenmue. Certainly the first time I remember seeing them in games. But then, and in that they were faintly annoying because you're watching a cutscene suddenly, oh wow, I need to do something and I just missed it.
Yeah.
Whereas, and it more puts you on edge at any given time. Whereas in this, the whole game is that, so I kind of don't mind that. What it is, like, it's just that's the gameplay style. But I think there's lots of stuff where it is like, hey, I'm going to simulate brushing my teeth. Hey, I'm going to simulate kind of putting out some plates and struggling to do that. I'm going to simulate kind of, everything. And I think the game has got so much kind of mechanical kind of, look at me, look how cool this is. You can do all this stuff, that the start of the game is really slow as a result. It's like there are just a few too many options that you can go and do. But what's really interesting I found is, so I'm not going to say that it was bad or anything, but what I found really interesting, it sort of goes into gameplay, is just how many of these scenes and how many of these shots and how much stuff from this game was reused as setups in Detroit Become Human. So much of this stuff, to the point where, this is more summary stuff, I think, at the end maybe, but so much of this stuff was just really just lifted wholesale, and they tried again in Detroit Become Human and got it right this time. Is the right way to is probably the way I would say of doing this. Like in terms of down to how the fight scenes work out, even to the choreography in the fight scenes, down to the setup in terms of, like, I found myself just frequently playing this going, oh okay, this is that scene from this. Oh okay, this is really that. Even the character interactions in terms of, oh, okay, so this is basically Connor as he is in Detroit Become Human, basically is Jaden in this film. In this game, they're basically the same character. It's just that Jaden is a futuristic character that doesn't fit, or more precisely, fits into the future that is Detroit Become Human, where all of that stuff actually makes sense. And it's just interesting. It's just really, I found that quite. That kind of, so the gameplay itself I found quite straightforward, but I couldn't take myself away from the fact that a lot of it just very much echoed a previous experience of another game, which in this case is weird because that game is however many years into the future, because it's a future release. So
yeah, it's you mentioned about sort of the tedious stuff, especially early on, just dragged a memory out from this game I completely forgot about. But you're so right. Some of the stuff where you're looking after Sean, and you've got to make his dinner, and you sit down and you stare at him while he eats, and you sit down and stare at him while he does homework. I literally, as much as I had great things to say about the visuals of this game, and I think it does look really good and it's held up really well 11 years on, I literally was crying with laughter at Ethan's. It's so, because it's weird, because it's like this game's trying to be ultra real but not, and he like microwaves the ugliest video game pizza I've ever seen for about 4 seconds and then serves it up. It was so weird to be like, I'm playing a video game and this is what I'm doing right now, microwaving a pizza for 4 seconds, and it looks terrible. Like, what am I doing in my life, kind of thing.
He gives him one slice and then leaves it out as well. Not exactly what I'd call
so
good
weird.
quality.
That whole bit's so weird. I completely forgot until now that it literally had me in tears. Jordan, what do you think of the gameplay of Heavy Rain?
Well, it's I mean, I do have a love-hate sort of relationship with David Cage's QTE framework. The whole notion that his games sort of depend on it, rely on it as his manner of effective storytelling. I've said before on this podcast that I'm not a fan of QuickTime events, and I actually consider they're the thing that actually hold Resident Evil 4 back from being perfect, because there is at least a high enough prevalence of them that they affect it. I don't feel as strongly with regards to Heavy Rain because, as Sharon pointed out, it's throughout the whole game, so you are acclimatized to it in time, not immediately. Certainly, a lot of those segments at the beginning, you can almost do wrong, and yeah, it becomes funny. I mean, I slammed every single plate down when it came to putting out the plates for the birthday party. Like it just became funny because then she gets upset, and Ethan's like, "Oh, I'm sorry," bang. "Oh, I'm sorry," bang. Just do it over and over. But eventually, I did get into the game, and I was engaged, and at that point I found that the QTs were effective, and there was a certain amount of weight to it that I appreciated. Not in every respect, like there were still sort of certain cases where I had a sort of a disregard for the consequences of the actions. Right at the beginning, it's sort of like, oh, we're asking Norman Jade, no, we're collecting money for a wristwatch. It's like, yeah, I'll chuck that in. That's not my money. And then it'd be like, right, you need to cut off your finger to save your son. Yeah, that's not my finger. Cut that off.
Yeah.
But there were also scenes where I was invested. I mean, I feel a little bit cheated when Steve mentions that you don't have to slow down when you're going through those tunnels full of glass. I absolutely did that as slow as humanly possible. It felt like Metal Gear Solid 4 again. And
I think it doesn't tell you.
It's weird though, because the thing is, obviously, you need a certain, especially on the PS3 controller, you need a certain amount of tension on the buttons sometimes, and throughout that whole segment, you're keeping a certain tension on the shoulder buttons, I believe, for actually progressing through the tunnel, and having it prolonged in that fashion. I don't know why that was something that engaged me more with the controls, because I had to keep control of something. I mean, I have some experience with the Move edition, because it was the edition that I first picked up with a bundle of the PS3 and the Move controller and all of that jazz. I mean, from my limited experience, because I didn't get far into the game the first time I played it. From my limited experience, it does help with some of the contextual actions. You'll certainly feel like you're more closely opening a door because of the fact that you're moving the controller in that kind of fashion. But in general, I wouldn't say it's necessarily worth it for a full playthrough. I suppose if you're sitting down in a particular space and you're ready to engage with motion controls in the same way that you would like a Wiimote or something, then it's effective and it works. And there's probably lots of contextual actions that I missed out on that were very clever. But I would say the controller does fine. I didn't mess up too many times. There were certainly some points where it's like, I can't tell if I meant to button mash at this point or my character is afraid, and that's why the UI is all shaking.
Yes, 100%.
So it tries to be minimal, but sometimes it's not always informative. And so that was a bit of an issue for me. But besides that, it wasn't that big of a deal. If I did mess up once or twice, it didn't have a grave consequence, except for Norman Jaden. But I mean, as far as the actual sort of game design, outside of controls, outside of typical kind of sequences and how you play, the actual idea of consequences, the idea that there is no such thing as a game over screen, was a massive endeavor to put in a game at that time. And it's not obviously entirely successful because it's to the detriment perhaps of some of the writing or some of the other aspects of the gameplay. But as somebody who was critical of that absence in Fahrenheit, I loved it in this. I love the fact that if I did something in one scene, it would have a follow-up. And I couldn't necessarily kind of escape that. If I messed up, the game sort of said, well, that matters. That is a part of this world. And obviously, a lot of games have taken that and really ran with it. You know, Telltale, it was pretty much built their entire sort of adventure series around that. And obviously, Quantic Dream has continued to make games in that respect. Until Dawn as well. That's another game that's sort of picked up that mantle and ran off with it. So it obviously it works. I think this was it was trying out new things and it doesn't quite hit the mark, but I did at least appreciate that stuff. I feel like it justified itself enough in that respect. The only sort of shortcoming I felt there was with the QuickTime events, because I've had an issue with some of these games in the respect that sometimes the scenes feel like they could purely be cutscenes, and I feel like these games are completely legitimate as games. I don't feel like they're just movies with button prompts put on. I don't think they're that shallow. I think it's a disservice to suggest it. But at the same time, there are scenes which really kind of go against that argument, because it'll literally be one shot of you get out of your car, you're standing and you're facing the door of a building, and the only thing you can do is press forward. That's it. And I just think, well, why don't you just like skip ahead a little bit or incorporate that into the cutscene, and then once I can explore a room and do a number of different things, that's when you give me the control.
Yeah.
Because I just feel like that's a bit sort of redundant. And there's also certain sequences that you can't actually move on from until you have done enough to satisfy the game. And the game kind of almost breaks the wall because it says, whoa, you forgot to do something. You know, you'll start leaving, and then suddenly in a monologue, we're like, actually, I've got to go do something else. And you do feel like you're then chained to whatever the game is trying to kind of progress in the story. So there's certain limitations. I mean, if you go to a fridge and you shake up the orange juice, you should have the freedom to be able to put it back in and not drink it.
It's too late now. You've committed.
If you go to a fridge and you shake up that orange juice, you've got to drink it. You've got to drink it all. It's really wasteful.
It's a waste of a shake.
But no, like it's yeah. But in seriousness, I think it has its strengths. But at this point, you could definitely tell there were certain limitations, which hopefully, I haven't played many games in this genre, but I certainly hope that it has been able to refine and expand upon since.
I just on the motion controls was the main thing. I don't know. Maybe I'd play it again at some point just to experience the motion controls. Mostly just because there are parts where I ask you to like jam down 4 different buttons at some point. I'd like to see what they're like on the motion controls, because I hated them on the controller, and maybe they're better with the PlayStation Move. I don't know.
Okay, one point about that with regards to, because there is one particular sequence where I think you have to like.
It's the electric fence thing that I'm thinking of.
Oh right, well I mean that is definitely one of them. The one I was thinking of is a whole lot more sillier than that, but it is the closest it feels like to a contextual action. Like, oh, this is what the character's hand is doing. Can't believe I'm going through this. The segment with Madison and Paco, when you got him by the balls, and you're slowly pressing onto more of the buttons on the controller, and by the time that you have got all the shoulder buttons and I think like 2 of the face buttons and whatever, you are gripping quite hard on your controller.
Yeah, fair point.
I thought, and I couldn't believe that my thoughts were thinking this. It was like, wow, a video game has actually been able to realistically depict grabbing somebody by the balls.
Good night, ladies and gents.
The Academy Award for Best Direction goes to David Cage.
Excellent. All right, let's wrap this up then. Final thoughts on Heavy Rain. Showen, since this was your pile of shame pick, I'm going to allow you to go first.
Thank you. I'm going to apologise to everybody for making them play this game they thoroughly didn't enjoy. Different type of shame. But no, I think, do you know, in summary, actually, despite all of the flack that I've given this game, I have to ultimately land at a point where I actually praise it. I think it's a very bold game. I think it's a game that needed to come into existence. Be nothing else. It's basically a game which came out and was massively influential, and created a whole slew of games and a whole bunch of stuff. Arguably a genre that followed on from it.
Yeah.
And I think you probably best summed it up by saying it's Alone in the Dark. And I think it basically produced a whole bunch of other stuff that followed on from it, which will really build on and capitalize what it is. And as we've shown, it's something where if you can see past a lot of flaws, then you probably have a game there. But I imagine it's a bit like Silent Hill 2 in the respect of, and don't worry, Si, I don't want to trigger you. It's a bit like Silent Hill 2 in the respect of, you look at this game, you say, this game was really, really, really important. Do you want to play it again? No. It's literally that. Except in Silent Hill 2's case, it's because you're just terrified of it. In this case, you are terrified of it, but for entirely different reasons. It is something where, and I mentioned Detroit Become Human earlier on. That game took what Heavy Rain did and polished it, and then made it really, really good. I genuinely feel that all the shortcomings that are visible here, just got taken and polished and turned into Detroit Become Human, and then that game is, by comparison, entirely very compelling and really thoroughly just a solid release. And that only came into existence because this thing had already come out, and sort of been the low budget version that came out several years before its time. I suspect is probably the way of saying it. Like this game is just ahead of its time.
Yeah, I think I agree with that.
And I think truthfully that's the best thing I can. That's the best and worst thing I can say about it, which is this is a swing and a miss, but it's a small flawed piece of genius in its own way.
Yeah, I think despite all the complaints that I have, I am sort of glad that I played it, and as a curiosity thing, something that I didn't really know too much about, as I said, being an Xbox player at the time, to go back and experience this and kind of understand what some of the hype was about. It's a really interesting game, but yeah, I agree. It might not necessarily succeed in quite a lot of what it sets out to do, but it does sort of lay the groundwork and the blueprint of what could possibly be achieved with these kind of ideas, such as mentioned, the lack of a game over in a way. There is no best ending almost. I found it kind of difficult at times to let go of, oops, I messed that up. No, that could theoretically be the right answer in the story. There is no actual canon ending to this, of course, because there's no sequels or anything like that. As far as I'm aware, there's been no official statement on what endings are the correct ones. So it's funny because it does make you think about it, and part of your brain wants to resist if you let a character die. Oh, can I reload a previous save? You can absolutely do that, but you that's not the point of the game. You kind of have to just let this story play out. But in the same token, does that mean that no choice matters at all? Is there, as Steve played it, trying to jeopardize certain characters or all characters you could play it as, because it doesn't really matter. It's all going to end anyway. Whatever happens, it's going to play out, whether you're involved or not, which is probably quite a dreary review, appropriate for such a dreary game.
I think, sorry, sir, I didn't mean to
go ahead.
Crush you there. I was going to say, I think this is a game where it's very much about the journey. Exactly
Absolutely.
As you've just said. It's not about getting the best ending or getting a certain ending. It's about playing through and experiencing the narrative, experiencing the characters, the emotions, it's the journey. It's very much a game where, from a narrative perspective, I enjoy the idea of playing through, and if you do something and it makes it makes a follow on, has follow on meaning or whatever else. It's absolutely that. The problem is is that the journey is not endearing or engaging or compelling, and that's the issue.
Yeah, unfortunately, whilst the ideas are really good, it's overall pretty unsatisfactory. Steve, what are your final thoughts on Heavy Rain?
So, this game is a commission of a cardinal sin for Steve. In that I can power through pretty much anything, given enough time, patience, and endurance. But when a game forces me not to care, and it's trying to have emotional weight, like this game feels to me like if someone got Hideo Kojima really drunk, got Yu Suzuki really drunk, and also Uwe Boll and put them in a blender. Like, I realize everyone else is going to dance around the issue, but I just can't get on with it. I think, like Sherwin said, Detroit Become Human is actually a fun game. Like, in some ways, it's a lot more compellingly written. But this, if I had to put it in the pantheon of David Cage games, I haven't played Omicron, the new Nomad Soul, so that one I don't get to talk about. This is crap. Like, the music's nice, but everything else, I just couldn't bring myself to get. Like, this is one of the few games where I've actually had to, I'm trying to get through it, and I just can't. I have to keep taking constant breaks. Playing this through at 15-minute intervals kills you because it just can't brings you in. I will say again, the music is nice in a vacuum. The characters are crap. The story itself feels like a teenager's approach to trying to be serious and adult. Yeah. Like, not to be too scathing to dear David Cage and everything, but it does feel like he's got the mind of a 16-year-old pretending he's 40. And I just can't get on with it. I apologize to people who think this is some kind of tentpole title. There are better ones on the PlayStation 3, I assure you. You've got Persona 4. You've got Metal Gear Solid 4. There are much more compelling titles that I can't think of right now that still validate my argument. So shut up, this game's rubbish.
Uncharted is the one thing for PlayStation 3 for me, as I said.
Oh yeah, if you want to be depressed and have a really sad story, play The Last of Us.
That's so true.
I don't understand why this was a tentpole title for so long. Like, visually, it's been outpaced. Narratively, it's been outpaced. Mechanically, it's been outpaced. As a cornerstone, maybe. In the Alone in the Dark way compared to Resident Evil, yeah. Oh, man. Right, okay, we have to move on because I'm just complaining. 1 out of 10.
James, any advance on 1? What's your final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm gonna be. It's gonna be very short. James likes sad. Okay, I like sad things because I like sad when it makes you feel human, and there's an element of hope there. But Heavy Rain has no humanity, and there is no hope.
Yeah, that's fair. It's so funny that we covered this after Silent Hill 2 as a bonus episode, because they are both kind of like that, but one's a really good game. Jordan, I think it falls to you to defend it, perhaps. What's your final summary of Heavy Rain?
If I was to put it in a line, I would say that I don't necessarily like it, but I respect it. Coming back to it all these years later, what is that, 11 years now? Yeah. And to come back, it does feel like a bit of an autopsy. I don't necessarily feel like I'm sitting down and trying to fully experience this game as it was entirely intended, because I'm just so fascinated by not only the hype and the build-up to when this game released, but also the subsequent details of the production that end up trickling out and giving some insight into what exactly it was like to make this game at the time that it was made. This sort of late 2000s idea of interactive drama and whether or not it was achievable with the technology that they had. There's lots of ways that it falls short, and there's lots of ways where it has aged quite poorly on a technical point. I would probably say that it is a similar analog to the likes of Alone in the Dark. I'd even risk saying that it kind of is a little bit in the same way that people view GoldenEye 64 these days. And a lot of people see that as very antiquated, and if you did not grow up with it, it's very hard to go back and try and understand the appeal of that game. But ultimately, it ended up creating a surge of inspiration within the industry that led to arguably far better products, and it was a good thing for the industry that it came about. So even though I wouldn't necessarily say that I enjoyed every aspect of this game, I do feel like the need to sort of almost defend its existence for the vision that it had, even if the execution wasn't necessarily there, and what it then inspired, not only in the studio that built it, but subsequent studios that took a lot of the inspiration from it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it is funny to be playing it 11 years later. Like, autopsy is such a great word for it. Because, as you and Sherwin have pointed out, we can already see evidence of the wider impact it had, the more arguably successful games, or at least more enjoyable games. So yeah, it's a weird one. It's so funny because when we do these, we generally don't tend to interact what our opinions are going to be before we came on the show. And yet I had a very strong feeling that this was going to be quite a negative episode. But I'm glad, we can at least say things like that about how it's important. And some of us do feel like, it was worth playing and experiencing that moment in time. But most certainly one of our most negative episodes. Nothing else remains for me but to thank our contributors and our Patreons once again. Support the show for as little as $1 a month to help us create more bonus content like this one over at patreon.com/FASprayPod. You can also join the Discord server to get in touch with members of the team and our community, discuss Resident Evil with us and other fans, and listen to the podcast live as it's being recorded. You can find a link to the server as well as our Twitter, Facebook, Twitch, Instagram, YouTube, and more at FASprayPod.com. You can find the podcast on YouTube, Stitcher, Spotify, and iTunes. And if you enjoyed the show, please do leave us a review where you can. It helps spread the word. Thank you to the panel. You can follow all of the Pueblo people individually. I'm at Cyniac_123. Steve is at FB Steve Was Taken. Jordan is at Cerealbox64. Sherwin is at Sherwin's Agenda. And James is at Moist Owl at OFF. And finally, thank you for listening and have a good week.
At one point, it was Microsoft may have been involved, but they wanted the story changed, and then Sony basically went, "Yeah, we'll do it instead," or something.
Microsoft didn't like the kidnapping angle, and I guess Sony did.
Well, I don't know. You're kind of jumping to conclusions there. Maybe they just didn't care. Not they liked it.
Yeah, I know. I'm just
imagine that meeting.
Like,
so there's a kidnapping. Sold. You've got it.
Quantic Dream walk in, they say, "Now look, we can scrap that," and Sony's like, "Well, actually, we'd kind of put money aside to guarantee that would stay in."
Yeah, well, that's a big part of our marketing plan, damn it.
That is a corner of the market that has not been found yet. So you're not finding that on Nintendo.
There's a reason for that.
You're not finding that on Nintendo. Amazing line.